away, Vanessa, with the question of a ceasefire in Gaza. What's the latest?
Yeah, the delightful Keir Starmer. I'm starting to kind of make up names for these people, like Sneer Karma. But anyway, allegedly he's called for immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, which goes against his previous stand, which is Israel has the right to defend itself. And if we can just move on, I can just have a look at what Labour has now called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza for the first time in an attempt to head off what threatens to be the biggest rebellion against Keir Starmer since he became party leader. So nothing political about this decision at all, sarcasm intended. Opposition whips published a 237-word amendment to a Scottish National Party motion on Tuesday, setting out the party's stance on the Middle East crisis, which they hope Labour MPs will back instead of a separate amendment from the SNP, calling much more bluntly for a ceasefire. A Labour Party spokesperson has made the following comments to various media outlets, including the BBC. So he's reiterating the amendment calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, whereas in reality the SNP is calling for a ceasefire. Humanitarian ceasefire to me means a pause in hostilities, which will not be respected as it hasn't been historically by Israel, and will then allow Israel to continue with the genocide immediately after. The focus on the need for Israeli hostages to be released and returned quite extraordinary, considering that there's an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 Palestinian hostages that have been taken both in the West Bank and from Gaza since October the 7th, of course, not mentioned. This is from Robert Peston, the ITV political editor. He understands this was about 10 hours ago. Keir Starmer will order his MPs to vote against the SNP's motion calling for a Gaza ceasefire because he hates the SNP's charge that Israel is engaging in the collective punishment of Palestinians, despite the fact that the ICJ has deemed it a plausible genocide. Starmer is still not admitting that. He knows many of his MPs will rebel against this three-line whip. The stakes will be highest for members of his frontbench team because they would be sacked if they vote in opposition to his instructions. So it's a gamble from Keir Starmer. It's certainly not a genuine desire to end hostilities against the Palestinians. And then bearing in mind the focus on the Israeli hostages, Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich sparks outrage after saying returning Gaza hostages is not the most important thing. And we know that a number of hostages have been killed by the Zionist hostility and bombardment of Gaza. So at a spontaneous demonstration following his remarks, a father of an 18-year-old in captivity said, anyone who thinks the hostages aren't important, then let them kidnap your children and then you can talk. Basically, Smotrich, he said he was asked if returning the hostages was the most important thing, and he replied, no, it's not. Why do you want competition? Everything is important. And he then also said on Can Public Radio, he is, of course, known as the far-right finance minister under the Netanyahu coalition regime, added that calls to release the hostages at any cost are incorrect and irresponsible statements. According to him, the only way to get them back is to defeat Hamas and increase military pressure even more. That's what brought about the previous deal. So what does that, of course, mean? That's effectively a green light for increased bombardment and ground invasion of Rafah in the far south of Gaza. That's supposedly the safe area and the last remaining safe area that has been bombed heavily for at least a week now. Moving on, Algeria called for a UN Security Council vote on Gaza ceasefire resolution. US, this was a few days ago, says it will veto the resolution. Algeria was representing a number of Arab states, and sure enough, the US vetoed the resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The UK abstained, so the usual double act. But I want to just listen to the statement from the US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield. Pay close attention to the last section of her statement.
We intend to do this the right way so that we can create the right conditions for a safer, more peaceful future. And we will continue to actively engage in the hard work of direct diplomacy on the ground until we reach a final solution.
I think we can start with Ron.
Interesting wording there, the use of the final solution, which of course is what we are witnessing, the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. And the US basically vetoed the Algerian resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire on the basis that they're actually working on a draft resolution. But I just want to focus, I could show an awful lot of very distressing footage, particularly from Rafah, of the recent bombing campaign by the IOF that has effectively wiped out entire families in Rafah, and particularly amongst the refugees there. Over 1.3 million people have gathered from different areas of Gaza to the so-called safety of Rafah. But I'm going to focus on northern Gaza, the famine and starvation. And this video is from a journalist in the north who's covering events there. And of course, the IOF has basically been sniping civilians that are trying to reach the meager supplies of flour and humanitarian aid that is literally trickling into the north, that is really suffering famine conditions now. And there are reports that the IOF has effectively created a road cutting northern Gaza from southern Gaza, which will be occupied by the IOF forces. So effectively, there will be no escape from the south to the north and no escape from the north to the south from here on in. So this is a journalist in northern Gaza talking about conditions there.
منذ أيام وأنا أبحث عن وجبة طعام واحدة ولا نجد، وهناك مئات الآلاف من المواطنين لا يستطيعون الحصول على طعام أو شراب أو أي مقومات للحياة. نحن في المرحلة الأشد والأصعب على أبناء شعبنا هنا في شمال غزة. الاحتلال يتعمد ذلك ويتعمد تجويع المواطنين هنا في شمال غزة ويتعمد منع دخول المساعدات والمواد الإغاثية والإنسانية. نحن الآن في كارثة والأمر يشتد الآن علينا، يشتد بشكل كبير. لا نستطيع أن نجد ما نسد به جوعنا وجوع أطفالنا وجوع عائلاتنا.
And in Rafah also, Egypt has basically not been opening the Egyptian Rafah border into Gaza to allow humanitarian aid in. And there is increasing starvation even in Gaza, Rafah itself. This is just a very quick video released today of people in Rafah trying to get bread from the supply. Actually, a friend of mine who I've been able to get in touch with on a fairly regular basis, he was displaced from the north finally to Rafah via Khan Yunis in sort of central Gaza. He told me that when you walk on the streets, you are literally walking among, as he describes it, the walking dead. He said they're like zombies, they're starving, they're terrified, they're traumatized. And of course, there is no medical care now in Rafah. There's no actual hospitals. There's only a sort of a very basic medical center. The other main hospitals have been destroyed or taken over by the IOF. And of course, the US veto, that's the fourth so far, to prevent any kind of immediate ceasefire or even demilitarization, which of course is what it should be, from Gaza by the Israeli forces. The first was a resolution from Brazil, then from UAE, then Russia, and now Algeria. So the US is clearly facilitating the genocide, and so is the UK.
Yeah, well, the UK is very proud of never having used its veto and only ever abstaining on this. But I mean, has the US given any indication of when its draft resolution is going to make an appearance after the final solution? No doubt.
No. And of course, ongoing with the potential shadow of a ceasefire, what does Israel do, as it always does and has done historically? It increases the ferocity of the attacks against civilians.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, Vanessa.